Welcome, folks. This is Ground Truth. I'm your host, Sam Faddis. With us today, a fascinating guest, John David Pitts, aka JD, who I've known for a number of years. And JD is a fascinating young guy who has lived a huge proportion of his not particularly long life in the Middle East and under conditions that I think most people can only imagine. And he's going to talk to us today about the reality of life in the Middle East for the average person on the ground. And then we're going to talk about extremism and how it is that somebody becomes an Islamic extremist and adopts this ideology. JD, welcome.
Hey, Sam, it's great to see you. Thanks for having me on your show.
So, JD, one of the hallmarks of Ground Truth is foundation. I usually start every program talking about this kind of thing. Who is this guest? Why the heck should I be listening to this guy? How the hell does he know anything about the Middle East, and what are his insights based on? So, can you give us just a few minutes about your background and how it is you ended up in the Middle East in the first place?
Well, I grew up in the great state of Tennessee, where I lived until I was about 20. And at that time, I set out and moved to the Middle East, where I lived for the next 15 years. Lived in Egypt, Sudan, Yemen, Mauritania, Syria, and Jordan. And along the way, was married and had a kid. And so, as you can imagine, I went through multiple stages of my life there. 20-year-old single guy to a 35-year-old husband and father. But there were two main things that were always important, very significant part of my life for those entire 15 years. One was the study of Islam in its various branches and forms. I studied Islam in traditional Islamic schools and mosques all across the Arab world. I studied under Sufi mystics in Syria, and I studied under hardline, ultra-conservative Salafists in Egypt. The study of Islam in its various branches and forms was very significant. It was always something that I spent a great deal of time and put a lot of effort into over the years. And the second was being involved in humanitarian aid work. My wife and I were deeply involved in humanitarian work for well over a decade. We lived and worked in refugee camps and slum communities throughout the Arab world, but spent a lot of years, a number of years in Egypt, living and working in some slum communities there.
Okay, JD. So, you're, no offense intended, skinny white boy from Tennessee, and you're 20 years old. And you decide to go off and, hey, let's go live in the slums of Cairo, I think, where you went initially. What the heck was going on in your mind at that point that you were motivated to do this?
Sure, there were a couple of things. The first was just a lifelong interest in other cultures, other religions, other parts of the world that had really been cultivated since a very young age. My childhood Saturday mornings were not spent watching cartoons. They were generally spent watching National Geographic Explorer. I had just been fascinated with other cultures, other parts of the world since a very, very young age. And so that, I would say, is what got me there. That's what motivated me to set out and to explore the world. But what kept me there for all of those years was a commitment to making the world a better place. I've always believed that each and every single one of us are called to change the world and to change it for the better, that we are all called to make the world a better place. And so that commitment to that is really, really what kept us there for all of those years.
Okay, so let's talk about living conditions. Let's talk about the reality of where you were living, because I have a picture of this. You certainly have very vivid pictures in your head. a lot of people that are watching this, I suspect, just don't really have any mental image based on any reality of what we're talking about, the living conditions, the physical reality, and then maybe, really ultimately more important, the psychological reality of living where you lived.
Yeah, Sam. I mean, for years we lived in some slum communities in Cairo, and these places, Sam, are really, really bad. They should not exist on Earth. You know that. You've seen some of these places. They are horrendous, and really, really, they should not exist anywhere. Living conditions are tough. Electricity is intermittent at best, which means that in the summers when it's 115, 120 degrees, you might have electricity for an hour to run a fan, and then you might not have it for another 12 hours, or you might not have it for a number of days. Water comes every night for a couple of hours. So in the slum communities, everybody gets up every night for a few hours to fill up buckets of water. But on top of that, the water that is coming into these communities oftentimes is contaminated with human feces. And so, as you can imagine, sickness is just rife. It's never ending. It's never ending. There is open sewage on the streets. And when I say open sewage, I don't mean a little trickle, a small little stream. What I mean is that every couple of weeks, the sewage system would become so overwhelmed that sewage would begin to flood the streets from one side to the other, 8, 10, 12 inches deep of raw sewage, raw human waste. And Sam, no one should live in those conditions. It robs people of their dignity. It takes it away. It takes value and self-worth away when you are made to live in conditions like that. And so it's bad. It's bad, the physical conditions. But then on top of that is the psychological impact as well of knowing the reality of the world in which you are living. And the reality for a lot of Egyptians living in slums is that life ain't fair. Life ain't fair. With that, I mean they know that they can work their tails off their entire lives in school, making excellent grades all the way through university. And chances are that they will not find a job, that they will not be able to get work after graduating because they were born and raised in the back streets of Cairo's slums, not in the wealthy neighborhoods. And they don't know the right people. They're not related to the right people to get those jobs. Jobs in Egypt oftentimes do not go to the most qualified, but they go to the person that is the most well-connected. And so the poor in Cairo are very well aware of that. They are aware of the fact that chances are they will not be able to get any sort of decent work throughout their lives, regardless of how hard they try and how well they do. And so that psychological impact, the toll that it takes on people is overwhelming. And you can see in these slums, in these communities, in these neighborhoods, on every single street corner, You've got 15 single guys, 20, 21, 22 years old, just standing around, bored out of their minds, and frustrated because they can't get work. They can't find work. But on top of that, they are also at the same time being exposed 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, to the lives of the wealthy, via the internet, YouTube, television. And so they are not at all ignorant as to how a lot of the world lives and as to what they are not being given the opportunity for. And so those are exactly who the ISIS recruiters, the Hamas recruiters, they are exactly the guys that those recruiters are going after. Young, educated, bored, and entirely aware of the good ways which the rest of the world is able to live. And so these recruiters, they come in and they prey on that. They prey on these guys that are just bored and frustrated and just sitting around all day long in these slums.
Okay, so we're talking living conditions, we're talking psychology. Let's take the next step, man. Ideology. Islamic extremism. What is the ideology in these areas?
Yeah, religious extremism, specifically the Egyptian Salafist movement, is rampant in the slums in Cairo, and it's growing rapidly, and it's bad. It's very, very bad. But let me make something very clear. I am in no way saying that Islam is bad. I do not believe that. Islam is a fine religion. It's a wonderful religion. It is a beautiful religion. I can honestly say that the most meaningful religious experiences I have ever had in my entire life were while worshiping alongside of Muslims in mosques in the Arab world. And so I have a very, very high regard for Islam. But the Egyptian Salafist movement is altogether different, something completely different. So the Salafist movement, it's a branch within Sunni Islam that advocates a return to the traditions of Salaf as-Salih, the pious forefathers, who are the first 3 generations of scholars after the Prophet Muhammad. And so the entire Salafist doctrine is centered around this idea, this concept of looking back to the earliest days of Islam to understand how the modern day world should be ordered to function properly. And so Salafists, they wholeheartedly believe that the one and only solution for the world's problems is for all of humanity to fully embrace Islam, but their ultra-conservative version of Islam. That is, in the mind of a Salafist, that is the only solution for the world's problems. And so what this looks like is ISIS. It's what it looks like practically. ISIS, their theology, their ideology, it is from the Salafist ideology, from that theology. It comes directly from it. Their entire worldview has been shaped from this very, very strict and uncompromising belief that the entire society should be based 100% on the first Sharia law that was set up when Muhammad and the first earliest followers of Islam went from Mecca to Medina in the year 622. So that was 9 years after Islam was founded in Mecca. So in 613, Muhammad began to preach the message of Islam in Mecca. In 622, 9 years later, the newly formed Muslim community left Mecca and went to Medina. And that is where the first Sharia law was set up, in that historical and cultural context. But Salafists and ISIS, they believe that societies now should emulate that perfectly. 100% should look like the society in Medina in 622. And so the beheadings, the murdering homosexuals by pushing them off the tops of buildings, the taking people as slaves, the taking people as sex slaves, the taxes on non-Muslims. I will give them this, that yes, all of those are statements from the Quran, but they are statements that for the past 1,500 years, the worldwide Muslim community has not believed that they should be taken literally. For 1,500 years, people have recognized that those statements were given and implemented in a very specific cultural and historical context. But now you've got, with ISIS, which is the Salafist theology. And so the Egyptian Salafist movement is also aiming for this, for the society to be entirely based on that first Sharia law that was set up in the year 622. But here is another thing that's important to remember. Not all Muslims in these slum communities in Egypt are Salafists. To be honest, the vast majority, the majority are not. The majority are not. And the majority do not want that. They do not want that version of hard-line, ultra-conservative Islam. That's not even the type of Islam that the majority of Muslims in slums in Egypt desire to practice. But at the same time, the overwhelming majority of Muslims in these slums in Cairo are quite sympathetic towards the Salafist movement, towards the Salafist ideology. And one of the reasons for that is because the social services in these slum communities, so the health clinics that people go to every time they're sick, the health clinics that my wife and I went to for treatment and care when we were sick. These are run by hardline Islamists. These are run by the Muslim Brotherhood or other Salafist-related entities, organizations. And so when your health care or when there is no water in the community, you have to go get bottled water, when you've run out of food, so you need, all of these things are distributed by and attained in Muslim Brotherhood-run facilities or Salafist-run mosques. And so while, yes, a lot of the Muslims in these slums are not Salafists themselves and do not even want that type of Islam, they're supportive simply because they are pragmatic, and all of the services that they receive that they need to survive are given to them by Salafist groups and Muslim Brotherhood-run groups.
Okay, so you got conditions that are hell on earth, and you have this, what I'm going to characterize as very dark version of Islam, but that still doesn't take us the final step. I mean, how does somebody, typically a young guy, become an Islamic extremist?
Sam, I think there are two main factors that are contributing to why we are seeing so many young guys joining these religious extremist groups and going off to join jihadists, to very violent acts, and to suicide bombers, to blowing themselves up. I think there are two main things. One is the socioeconomic factor, and the other is the religious aspect. And so the socioeconomic, that's pretty simple to explain, pretty simple to understand. When you live in the filth and squalor of some of these slums, some of these refugee camps, when you have no hope whatsoever for a better future, for a better life, why not? Why not? You have no hope for anything that you see in your day-to-day life, in your world. So, why not? Why not? Second is the religious aspect. And so you need to understand that these groups, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, the Salafist movement, they are what I would say is apocalyptic. They have a very strong emphasis on end times theology, on the final days, and they are literalist in the sense that they believe 100% very strongly in a literal heaven and a literal hell, a literal life after death. And for them, non-Muslims and bad Muslims will spend eternity in hell, and good Muslims will spend eternity in heaven, in paradise. And for Muslims, hell is a lake of fire where there is a devil with a pitchfork and torment and torture for eternity. But for them, heaven, paradise, is a place where there is no poverty, only riches, where there are streets made of gold, where there is no sickness, only good health, where there is no discrimination, and where there is justice. And so, as you can imagine, Sam, for folks who grow up in the filth and squalor of refugee camps, with no hope whatsoever of a better life this side of heaven, embracing a religious view, a religion that offers the hope for eternal paradise is a beautiful thing. It is a very, very easy thing to embrace. And that right there is what the recruiters, the ISIS recruiters, the Hamas recruiters, that is what they are using, plain and simple. They are exploiting these folks' misery in order to manipulate them, to convince them to go off and commit these horrible acts of violence, evil acts of violence, blowing themselves up in markets, blowing themselves up in places of worship, killing innocent civilians. These evil acts that these young guys are going and doing, they have been manipulated by these recruiters to go and do that. These recruiters are exploiting the misery of their current life conditions, their current misery, and they are sending them off to commit these atrocities to further their own sick and twisted political and social agendas. Plain and simple, that's what they're doing. And so the acts are evil, are horrible that these young men are committing. But I don't judge the guys for this. I don't judge and blame them for that. Because, you see, when I first went to Egypt, I wasn't a Muslim fundamentalist, but I was an evangelical Christian fundamentalist. And so I also, believed in this literal heaven and literal hell. I also, had this hope of spending eternity, in a place with no sickness, a place where we would see our loved ones again, a place where there are no wars, where there is only peace. I hoped for that. Who wouldn't? Who wouldn't hope for that? And I longed for that so strongly. I had embraced that belief so strongly that I was willing to do anything that I believed my religion was instructing. My religious views were leading me to do at that time. I was willing to do that because I believed so strongly and had so much hope for paradise, for heaven, for that great place. And so I can understand. I can understand why these guys can so easily be manipulated and turned into jihadists, violent jihadists, and sent off to carry out these evil acts of violence that are furthering someone else's sick and twisted political and social agendas. In other words, the leaders of these groups, who are not leaders. They are not leaders. They are cowards. They are cowards. A leader would say, "Come follow me. I will strap this bomb to my chest. And I will go and commit this act of violence. come and follow me. That's what a leader would do. But these are not leaders of these groups. They are cowards because they are going and getting these guys and sending them to commit these acts, to commit these evil acts of violence. But I don't blame, I don't judge the young guys that are going off to do this. So I understand one, their physical situation, what they are trying to escape. And I also understand what it is like to believe so strongly in something that you are willing to do anything to attain that.
JD, thanks a lot for being here, man. I really appreciate it. We're obviously going to come back to you frequently because, my God, there's days of information in your head that we need to get into. Why don't you talk to us a little bit right now about what you're up to now, your new company, maybe not so new company by this stage, and the kind of services that you provide to people that are thinking about moving to the Middle East, doing business in the Middle East.
Well, Ahlan International is a cultural advisory and training firm. We specialize in Arab culture and language, the Middle East, and Islam. And so I do a lot of teaching and instructing on Islamics, the Middle East, Arab culture, Arabic language, and cross-cultural communication skills. I do that in small group and larger group settings. I will teach in seminars at universities, churches, conferences. In addition to teaching and instructing, I also work directly with individuals and entire families that are going to be relocating to the Arab world. So I will work with them before they go and during that transition just to help prepare them for life, whether they are going to serve as humanitarian aid worker, whether they are going as a diplomat, whether they're going as a representative of a multinational or to teach English. There are a lot of cross-cultural differences that one must learn about in order to really thrive, both professionally and personally. A lot of that's just the day-to-day nitty-grittiness of life there. And so I work with folks before they go to help prepare them to make that transition, to help prepare them to really thrive during their assignment, their time overseas.
JD, again, thanks. Can't thank you enough, really. And we'll be talking to you soon. Thanks for being here. Fabulous stuff.
Thanks for having me, Sam. It was great to be with you. Look forward to talking again.
Folks, that does it for us for today on Ground Truth. We'll be talking to you next time, and we'll be continuing this quest to actually find some facts and provide some insights as opposed to hysteria and spin. I'm Sam Faddis. Thanks for being with us.